Hello, my friends. Welcome to my corner. When I was in college, I took a course titled The Mexican Novel. I got the list of books from my professor that we were going to read, and I spent basically the entire summer reading those books. Now, get this 2 weeks before the semester began, the professor that was going to teach the course was appointed chair of the department, and the course was cancelled. Okay, I'll be honest with you, at that point I was a little bit upset, okay, but at the same time I was still happy because otherwise I would not have gotten the chance to explore these books that she planned to include in the course. One of the books that had been included was this little text right here, Farabeuf o La Crónica de un Instante by Salvador Elizondo. Now, I will say this. Back then, Mexican literature was not really my area of study, so I had not really read many Mexican novels, and I'm ashamed to say that the name of Salvador Elizondo actually meant nothing to me at that point. But of the texts that we were going to discuss in that class that never happened, this is the one that made the most shattering impact on me. That's the word that I'm going to use, okay? It was also the shortest book that we read. So I thought that was very interesting. You know, we were reading very complex works, very lengthy works also, but this was the one that grabbed my attention. I read it compulsively, horrified, but completely unable to put it down. You know, I just could not stop reading. So that to me is the mark of a good book, a book that in a sense you don't want to read, right? You don't want to push yourself through that experience, but at the same time you can't help turning the pages. I remember one moment that's stood with me all of these years, just looking at the pages, just checking out the book, and then being like, oh look, there's a picture here, what's this, and then being like, oh my god, right? So I want to make a little bit of a disclaimer based on that, okay? Please be advised that this is a very disturbing little book, okay? It's not for everybody, so I will say that, and I just wanted to mention that. You'll see what I mean as we approach it and as we discuss it, okay? My video, by the way, is not disturbing, unless of course you find me to be disturbing or something like that, but the book is, okay? So keep that in mind if you're planning to explore the work of Salvador Elizondo. First of all then, let me give you a little bit of information about the author, so that we can have some kind of a context in which to explore the texts. So Salvador Elizondo is usually associated with what people have come to call the post-boom, which is kind of a ridiculous, kind of an absurd label, because it really includes authors of all sorts who explore themes of all sorts also. But then, I ask myself, isn't that always the case? Could you not say the same thing about the boom authors? They are very different also, even though they have similarities and affinities between them. The label, may not be perfect, but it kind of works. The authors that came after the boom, right? So it's that kind of a thing. If you ask me, right, what is the salient feature of these post-boom authors? I would say one of them, like the first thing that comes to my mind at least, is the lack of local color. You know, the kind of local color that you would find in Garcia Marquez, or maybe in Carlos Fuentes, Vargas Llosa, even in Cortázar, right? These authors purposely did away with that, right? They did not want to be associated with a particular place. So you can basically take these works, which are universal, and kind of transplant them to another national context, right? And you're not really doing any violence to them, because that was part of the point, right? Part of the point was precisely to stay away from local, specific places. And some of the authors who belong to this category, or to this movement, if you want to call it that, really emphasized the importance of language, okay? So if you asked me, who would you compare Elizondo to, I would say, well, maybe the Cuban author Severo Sarduy, right? Maybe Guillermo Cabrera Infante, also from Cuba. Maybe in the context of Argentina with Osvaldo Lamborghini. These authors who really started to pay attention to language itself. Language becomes kind of like the protagonist of these works. And because of that, if we're going to look beyond the context of Latin America, one connection that has been made with Elizondo is the connection with the Nouveau Roman. Okay? Now that connection, that comparison must be qualified, but at the same time it is a helpful one, and I would say it is a fair connection. The influence of Alain Robbe-Grillet is really, really patent in his work. And I would also say that as I read Elizondo, I saw a little bit of an influence of Claude Simon. And in terms of mode, if we talk about the mode that Elizondo generally, right, writes in, the first concept that comes to mind is that of meta-fiction. Okay, so if you like meta-fiction, then definitely you're going to be happy in Elizondo's house. Okay, he wrote 3 longish works, which are, of course, the one that I mentioned before, Farabeuf o La Crónica de un Instante, then El Hipogeo Secreto, which has been translated into English as The Secret Crypt. And then there's another one that is completely different from these two, and it's actually a later text from 1988 titled Elsinore, un cuaderno. Okay, completely different. I'm going to give you a little bit of information about that one towards the end of this video, just so you know what it's about. Then there's a very important book of short fiction that he wrote titled El Grafógrafo, so the graphographer, if you wanted a quick translation into English. And other than those, I have read 3 more books by him. Narda o el Verano, El Retrato de Zoe y Otras Mentiras, both of which are collections of short stories. And then I also read his Autobiografía Precoz. He calls it that, precocious autobiography, because he published this autobiography when he was 34 years old, which I think is fascinating. Just writing your autobiography when you're 34 and you have published maybe, 1 important book and 2 other books or something like that. So it's really a very, very interesting text. And he talks about Farabeuf in that text. So it's illuminating in many ways. Now, the critics speak of a kind of trilogy when it comes to Elizondo's corpus, and it's a trilogy that deals with language. It's kind of like a metafictional trilogy where language is the main preoccupation, and that is composed by Farabeuf, El Hipogeo Secreto, The Secret Crypt, and the graphographer, El Grafógrafo. Okay, so the first 2 are available in English, and I'm pretty sure that the graphographer is going to become available one of these years. I'm pretty sure. It's not a very long book. It would be easy to translate. So, I mean, no book is easy to translate, but you know what I'm saying, right? So what I wanted to do is really to explore, these works. I wanted to give you mainly information about Farabeuf and about El Hipogeo Secreto, and then very briefly touch upon El Grafógrafo so that you know what would be that third movement or third step, if you will, in Elizondo's development of these novels that deal primarily with language. So let's see what we have here. Elizondo's first narrative work was a very important one, and it won the Javier Villaurrutia Prize. It was published in 1965, and that is Farabeuf o La Crónica de un Instante. If you ask me to describe this in a nutshell, I would say this is the Nouveau Roman meets the Marquis de Sade through Georges Bataille. Okay, I know that's quite a handful right there, but that's the best that I can do. It is less than 150 pages in its original Spanish, and it's divided into 9 chapters of more or less equal length. Now, this book is very easy to describe, but do not let that mislead you. Okay, this is a very rich, very complex little text. What is this, right? I would say it is exactly what the title indicates. It is the chronicle of an instant captured by a certain Dr. Farabeuf, and the instant in question is the torture and execution of a man in China by the method known as Long Che. Okay, so that is what we have at the center of this narrative. Narrative is really a problematic word here, so I should not really use it, so excuse me for that, but we'll see what I mean in a couple of minutes. So I say that, as I was reading Farabeuf, it struck me that it was structured like a musical piece. You know how in music you have leitmotifs, right? And in this case you have 3 of them, and the leitmotifs of Farabeuf are torture, surgery, and coitus. Okay, these are intertwined, interwoven, and you can already see probably why I said that this was a kind of, rather disturbing text right here. So we have the main events, the execution, right, the medical practice of Dr. Farabeuf, and the meeting of 2 lovers who find the picture taken by Farabeuf. By the way, this is not historical. Okay, Elizondo changed history a little bit. So the picture in reality was not taken by any Dr. Farabeuf or anything like that, though there was a Dr. Louis Farabeuf, and he wrote a treatise on medicine that, in a sense, you could say that this little book is kind of a parody of that, but that's another story, right? He took events and kind of changed them to fit his poetic needs. So the leitmotifs and the recurring scenes and the recurring images are presented to us in the first chapter of the text. So when you read the first chapter, it seems like a musical piece that is announcing the sequences, right, and the leitmotifs that are going to be repeated throughout. Just like that chapter of Ulysses, right? I can't exactly remember which one it is, but you may know which one I'm talking about. You have all these sounds, all these onomatopoeic sounds at the beginning, and they are, themes that are kind of announced that will take place throughout that chapter. So the things, the events that I just mentioned are included in that first chapter, but you also get other things, like for example the book of the I Ching, right, the book of changes as it is known, the Ouija board. All of these are going to become important in the text, so they are mentioned in that first chapter right there. And from that very first moment, right, as soon as we begin the text, what we see is the central image that is approached from different perspectives. It is examined, re-examined, and reinterpreted throughout Farabeuf as a text. That is what this text does, okay? Re-examination, reinterpretation. That is a key element and a key concept when it comes to approaching this little book. So in a sense, I would say, if you asked me, okay, what is the main theme of Farabeuf? Something that is kind of unexpected. I would say that the main theme here is the gaze, okay, and by extension also the concept of spectacle. This is really a book that you can apply all those theories about spectacle to. So if you're into that, definitely try to read this book within that kind of a frame. And you see the characters, or we witness the characters trying to make sense of what they have seen, of what they have experienced, right? But everything here in this little ecosystem that is Farabeuf is just very fluid, including the characters themselves. Okay, so nothing is real, in the words of those, very good friends of mine. Just to give you an example, in chapter 3, at the beginning, you get kind of a summary of what has happened, of the story, or of the plot, right? That is meant sort of for the traditional reader who wants to make sense of things, right? And what really has happened? Not much happens really in this text. In a sense, you could say that nothing really happens, because that instant that we have at the center is really a static image. But what has happened is that there's a couple, they're walking on the beach, they find a dead starfish. That dead starfish becomes the Chinese ideogram of Liu. And then that Chinese ideogram is also associated with the man who was executed. So you can see what I mean, like everything kind of changes. Identity, objects merge, into each other and things like that. So that's why this is a very complex text, because it is really a series of symbols that transform themselves and become different things throughout. Let's talk about the structure and the style a little bit. In this case, the narrative, and once again, when I say narrative, you have to imagine quotation marks there, is fragmented, okay? So we have, really a narrative that is cut into pieces, appropriately in this case. So let me give you a little quote from the text that kind of alludes to that, because this is a self-reflective text, Muchas veces pienso que no he pasado nada por alto, absolutamente nada, pero hay resquicios en esta trama en los que se esconde esa esencia que todo lo vuelve así, indefinido e incomprensible. So the key word here to me is resquicios. Another word in Spanish that we use a lot in these cases is intersticios, right? There are those spaces between things, right? And that's really important. In this case, we have a text that is really pervaded by a sense of mystery. It is an enigma, right? And because we are human, we try to make sense of that enigma. But sometimes, it is very, very difficult to get to the truth. And this would be a great example. Now, something very interesting when it comes to structure and this little text is that the text begins and ends with the same word. And it is actually not just a word, but a question. And the question is, ¿recuerdas? So that means, do you remember? You could say remember in English, but it doesn't, in Spanish it has the conjugation to it. So you already know who the question is addressing. And by the way, that is a very effective element of this text, the use of the second person, because it really involves us. It makes you part of this narrative once again, right? So it is very effective in that, drawing us into the text and making us a part of the mystery. Now, the structure like that, right, the beginning and the ending, that is basically the same word, also points to a very important text that this is a meta text of, which is of course Finnegans Wake. Finnegans Wake is also a text that never ends. It's a never-ending story, literally. It does not, however, this is something that I like to make a difference here. I would not say that Farabeuf has a circular structure. Okay, to me the structure of Farabeuf is more of a spiral. Okay, and there's a very, very big difference here. With the circle, you're always going around, right, in the same direction and everything. When it comes to the spiral, you know how it is. You're at one point and then you come back to it, right? You know, theoretically you're at the same spot and you keep coming back to that place, but at different levels, right? It's not the same thing. So you come back to the same place but differently from another. You can see the place where you were from a different angle, and that is exactly what Farabeuf is all about. Let me share with you another quote. We talked about that scene of the execution, right, the torture, and this is what the narrator says here. El suplicio es una forma de escritura. Asistes a la dramatización de un ideograma. Aquí se representa un signo, y la muerte no es sino un conjunto de líneas que tú, en el olvido, trazaste sobre un vidrio empañado. Hubieras deseado descifrarlo, lo sé, pero el significado de esa palabra es una emoción incomprensible e indescifrable, nada más que una sensación a la que las palabras le son insuficientes. Tienes que embriagarte de vacío. Estás ante un hecho extremo. So once again, this concept of, re-examining and reinterpreting things. We keep coming back to them, but at different levels. We keep coming back at them from different perspectives. And I think, this idea of the spiral structure is something that is related to a specific genre. You may already expect this from me, but let me say this. Most people describe Farabeuf as a novel. When I was in college, I wrote an essay about Farabeuf, trying to prove, arguing that Farabeuf is actually a novella, if we want to put a label on it in terms of the genre, right? And here's something very interesting. In the first edition of Farabeuf, and this would kind of prove my point. I mean, there are many things I think that prove my point, but in this case, I think this is important. The first edition had an inscription here that said, a novel, right? And in later editions, that inscription is not there anymore. And I think it's not crazy to think that maybe Elizondo had something to do with that. He was probably like, that thing that says a novel, right? Una novela or whatever, just get rid of that, right? It's not a novel, okay? I think it's really a novella. Repetition, expansion, right? Focus on a situation that is re-examined. All of these things that we associate with the novella are present here. And also, this thing that I shared with you recently, remember Deleuze and Guattari on A Thousand Plateaus, right? They have that essay on the novella, and they say that the question for the novella is what happened, right, in the past tense. Not what will happen, as in maybe the short story, and maybe sometimes in the novel, though you expect also some development in the novel, but what happened. And I mean, when you hear about something like what happened in this text, right, this man who was tortured and executed, really, you have to ask yourself, what happened there? Like, why did that happen to him? What is the story behind this? And that's what you try to find out in the novella, and sometimes, that doesn't happen. You don't really find out, but that's another story, right? So I would describe Farabeuf as disturbing, obsessive, and delirious. It is really a shocker, okay? When I read it the first time and the second time, I was really like, wow, this is almost like the text that you have to be like, okay, I'm going to put it down for a while, read something else, maybe listen to some happy music or something like that, and then come back to it. But I think, if you ask me honestly, okay, now that I have read more by Elizondo, I don't think his purpose is to shock, just to shock, right? Just for the sake of shocking. I think really, if we consider the text, there is much more to it than that. I think one of the purposes of Farabeuf is to make us realize how fragile what we call reality really is. We tend to see things in terms of, univocally, right? And this is not, it's saying, no, reality is not really like that. Things are very complex. And if you think of a photograph, for instance, maybe not now with all this AI going on and all that, but at one point a photograph was considered to be incontrovertible evidence that something had happened, right? If you have a photograph, you have evidence. It did happen, right? But it is not always like that, right? photographs are very complex, and as this text shows, they can be interpreted in many different ways. I wanted to share with you a quote from Susan Sontag. She wrote that essay on photography, right? And in that little essay, she says, if photographs are messages, the message is both transparent and mysterious. A photograph is a secret about a secret, as Arbus observed. The more it tells you, the less you know. And that is definitely something that you see at play here in Far Above, because the photograph that seems so obvious, right, so brutal, it really becomes something ambiguous by the end of the text of the novella, right? So Far Above really demonstrates something that has always fascinated me, and that is the fact that everything is a symbol of itself. You look at something and it seems simple, but really when you start considering all the things that are behind an object or an image of something that happened, it is really a complexity that is just staggering, right? So I think that is one of the reasons why I like Far Above so much. I think really one of the things that it tries to do is to try to make us realize that the world around us is a text, ourselves included, and that text has really an infinite number of interpretations. So I think this is a fascinating novella, and it's really short. It does so many things in only 150 pages, or even less than that. Then I have The Secret Crypt, El Hipogeo Secreto, okay? This is a novel, okay, I'll say that. So yeah, don't expect me to change this or to turn this into a novella, because I don't think it is. I think this is really a novel. And if you look at the back cover description, we have some very important names thrown at us here: Macedonio Fernandez and Ricardo Piglia. Okay, so I think it's great that they connected this text to Argentine writers for obvious reasons, right? But I think the connections are good. You know, Macedonio Fernandez and the Museo de la Novela de la Eterna, Ricardo Piglia and La Ciudad Ausente, the absent city, you know, because the concept of the city is really important in this novel of The Secret Crypt. I would also add a third name here, not Argentinian, okay, and that is the name of Samuel Beckett, for the main reason that Beckett really is preoccupied primarily with language. Language becomes the protagonist of his works, and not only language, but the writing, you know, the writing itself. So that's another connection that I see right here with this work by Elizondo. The main theme of El Hipogeo Secreto is the impossibility of narrating, something that was present in a way already in Far Above, but here becomes more important. The inadequacy of words. Okay, words are what we have. They are our materials. They are what we build with, right? And it's interesting to use the term to build here, because we have actually a structure, a building, which is the hipogeo. The title, El Hipogeo Secreto, would be translated into English, you know, literally the secret hypogeum. But you see why that doesn't work. Just as, you know, La Cripta Secreta doesn't work in Spanish. I think the translation is really, really good here. But, you know, La Cripta Secreta sounds like, I don't know, a title of a bestseller or something like that in Spanish. So El Hipogeo Secreto in English, much better translated as The Secret Crypt. It has an epigraph from Finnegans Wake. Okay, so yes, you know, that is definitely quite appropriate here. But the world, mind, is, was, and will be writing its own runes forever, man, on all matters that fall under the ban of our infra-rational senses. So the connection here made with Finnegans Wake is already telling us something, just as it was there in you know, Far Above. The Secret Crypt then is Elizondo's second movement, right, in this development of this idea of the impossibility of narrating, right? And Far Above, it explores really a world of ambiguous symbols, right, a kind of a gestalt almost, right, how we read symbols that are not complete and we kind of complete them with pieces of ourselves in a way. But in that book, the author had not really entered the work. The author was still outside as a kind of a creator figure. El Hipogeo Secreto takes things a little bit farther, because here the author is included in the narrative once again. You know, the author has entered the text, or another way to look at it is that the text has grown so much that it has absorbed the author. It has absorbed us, you know, as readers, as characters. The reader is a character also. You know, it's really mind-blowing when you start thinking about the implications of this. So one thing that you could ask is, okay, so what is El Hipogeo Secreto about? And I'm going to answer that as Elizondo would. And I'm not, this is not a joke. But El Hipogeo Secreto is about El Hipogeo Secreto. Okay, that's really the way that the author would have put it, and that's the best way to describe it. Having read the novel, I can tell you that's really the best that I can come up with. I am going to give you a little bit more information about it, though. So in terms of the contents, right, what we have here is 150 pages. Divided into 4 chapters of very unequal length. Like the 4th chapter, for instance, is very long, and the chapters, just as in Farabeuf, are not numbered. So that adds to the complexity of the texts these both of these texts. Also, we have here in El Hipogeo Secreto the same involving effect of the second person, quote unquote, narration. Right, so you also find yourself involved in the text through that device. I thought about Aura, right, by Carlos Fuentes, in which also he uses that second person narrator to kind of make you part of it. There are characters here, believe it or not, but they are identified by initials. So you have a character's named X, then you have I, then you have E, then you have pseudo T. You know, it gets really funny at some point. There's a character known as the know-it-all. Then you have the fire flower, right? And the woman known as Mia, but also referred to rather, unflatteringly as La Perra, right? That's the way that they refer to her in the narrative. And some of these, by the way, may be the same character. Okay, so it's really interesting in that sense. And then let's also remember a very important character known as the Imagined, who is, if I'm reading the text correctly, also Salvador Elizondo, referred to by name here as Salvador Elizondo, assuming, of course, that they are the same person. Now, just as in Farabeuf, right, there are recurring images. For instance, there is a photograph here too. So you can tell that photographs are important for Elizondo. There is a photograph of a woman. There is a sundial that has an inscription to it that is illegible. They are trying to make sense of this inscription. You can see this idea of trying to decipher things, right? These are texts that you try to decipher. There's a red leather notebook that is titled The Secret Crypt. So you see, there's an insect also trapped in amber. So all of these images recur through the book, and the characters try to make sense of them. The novel, just like Farabeuf, is structured as a musical piece, and you can see different motifs that kind of repeat themselves, throughout the text. And as I read that, as I thought about that, I was thinking of El Otoño del Patriarca, The Autumn of the Patriarch, by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Completely different approach. That is really a novel. It has a central character and everything. But it is also a musical piece. And also I thought about the repetitions and the echoes that you hear in a movie like Last Year at Marienbad, to make the connection there with Robbe-Grillet. So all of those are texts that you can kind of associate the Secret Crypt with. The universe in this novel, right, is presented as language. So the universe is seen as a huge dictionary. Let me read you a quote that kind of gives you an idea of what we're dealing with here. It's necessary to live life insofar as we're able to do so in the same way as we write a novel. For example, right now I am writing a novel about which I know nothing. I only guess at the general outline of the plot. It's about a writer writing a book. However, what's important is what this book is about. The book the writer is writing there, near a woman reading a book with a red cover in which the writer is written in the act of writing this book. So you can see this is the kind of text that we get. It is a narrative of sorts, but you can see how complex it is. Unlike Farabeuf, there is a plot of sorts here. There is even a climax in El Hipogeo Secreto, The Secret Crypt, believe it or not. The characters are the members of a secret society known as Urkreis. Okay, and what they're doing is they're trying to get in touch with the Imagined, who is the author, who is also Salvador Elizondo. So if you want a plot, right, that is it. You have characters who belong to a secret society. They're trying to make sense of their existence, and in order to do that, they want to reach this Imagined, right, who is a sort of Wizard of Oz kind of figure, who might, help them to make sense of their situation. Now, are you ready for the connection? I am talking, of course, about the Borges connection, right? I believe there is a Borges connection right here. Because the author is referred to as the Imagined, right? You can think about this. An author is somebody who imagines characters into being, but in this case, he's referred to as the imagined. So I think we are meant to think of Borges' short story, Las Ruinas Circulares, the circular ruins, right? In this case, we have an author who is imagining characters, but because he is called the imagined, right? We have to assume that he is also in turn imagined by somebody else, and we are meant to think that maybe that's all of us. We are all characters in a novel or an anti-novel, right? We are all part of a text. If the universe is really a collection of words, if the universe is a dictionary, then we are just the letters of our names, right? So that's the connection right there with with the Borges text. I think that El Hipogeo Secreto is, among other things, right, a rewriting and an expansion of that story by Borges. And just this idea, right, I would say it makes the novel a great example of mise en abîme. That image that contains the same image, that contains the same image, that kind of thing. I think in the English-speaking world, it was a box of Quaker oats or something like that people thought about when they think about this concept. And it made me think of André Gide, right, his novel The Counterfeiters, which is, includes a text known as The Counterfeiters. Sábato, in his novel Abaddon el Exterminador, who is, includes a character known as Ernesto Sábato, who is thinking about writing this novel. And also José Donoso, right, in Casa de Campo. There's a part that makes allusion towards the end of the novel, right, and the author within the novel. So you get this never-ending kind of sequence of images within images. And that is what El Hipogeo Secreto is, because we constantly read in El Hipogeo Secreto about this text titled El Hipogeo Secreto, and about Salvador Elizondo, who is supposedly the author of this text. So it is really disorienting in that sense. I kept thinking about, Penelope, weaving and unweaving. You feel like this text is becoming something, and when you feel that you're about to grasp it, it becomes something else, or it's woven and unwoven. That's how I see it. And it's a text really that undermines itself, and it questions the very notion of reality. I have another quote for you here that illustrates that undermining of reality. All writing is the attempt to comprehend and convey a vision that is maybe or perhaps incomprehensible, maybe or perhaps incommunicable. That vision which takes on the characteristics of hallucination in the minds of characters who narrate a story in the first person. That fantasy is inadvertently the awareness of a dream trapped in the shackles of wakefulness, which is to say, all writing is the realization of insomnia, and literary creation an uncontrollable aspiration to dream. Great quote. Okay, I think that illustrates the Secret Crypt very well. Farabeuf did the same thing, right? Through the analysis. Analysis, as you know, means literally to take apart, to take to pieces. So that's kind of appropriate also to that novella. So through the analysis of a photograph, right? It does the same thing, to undermine reality. But El Hipogeo Secreto takes that quite farther. It goes much further. It is literally about the death of the author and the collapse of narrative. So it is Farabeuf, but another step, maybe another movement. Maybe a step has different connotations that I don't particularly like. So the action here is really taking place in a world in the making, in a world powerless to be born, as that poetic line goes. So I think that's what makes this novel quite fascinating to me. Hipogeo is really a rewriting of Farabeuf, in a way, right? That's one way that we can approach it. It really takes things a little farther and excludes the morbid element. So that's another thing that I like about it, right? Remember Cortázar, Continuity of Parks, Continuidad de los Parques? I think El Hipogeo Secreto, without trying to give too much away, is Continuidad de los Parques, but at the center it has, instead of a reader, an author, right? So it's that never-ending text that is inside itself and involves us, right? So I don't know. That's one way that I would describe El Hipogeo Secreto. And a quote came to mind as I was reading Elizondo, or rereading him. And it's a quote that I have already shared with you, I think in the video on Stephen King's The Dark Half. And it's a quote by Claude Simon, which I think is quite appropriate. He says, "Le roman se fait. Je le fais et il me fait." The novel makes itself. I make it and it makes me. Literally, in this case. Because inside the novel we have the author, Salvador Elizondo, writing the novel. So as the novel is made, he is also made. But read the novels to see how that develops in the text. I think that After reading El Hipogeo Secreto, you realize that Farabeuf is not really just a sensationalist. It's not just the product of an adolescent desire to shock the reader or to be disturbing, but an exploration of the purely human phenomenon that is language. That is what is at work in these two texts right here. And there is a third and final step in Elizondo's development of his exploration of the precariousness of language, and that is El Grafógrafo, or the graphographer. This is a work that explores what is left after the death of narrative, after the collapse of discourse and of our system of symbols. And what is left after that? Well, the answer seems to be that what is left is just scribbling, just writing for the sake of writing, writing that is neither meaningful nor meaningless, but just is. Now, to analyze something like El Grafógrafo goes against the very nature of this work. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to read you one little text from this collection so that you can get an idea of what it's like. And I think this text speaks for itself. So this is what El Grafógrafo sounds like. Escribo. Escribo que escribo. Mentalmente me veo escribir que escribo y también puedo verme ver que escribo. Me recuerdo escribiendo, ya, y también viéndome que escribía. Y me veo recordando que me veo escribir, y me recuerdo viéndome recordar que escribía, y escribo viéndome escribir que recuerdo haberme visto, que me veía escribir, que recordaba haberme visto escribir que escribía, y que escribía que escribo que escribía. También puedo imaginarme escribiendo, que ya había escrito, que me imaginaría escribiendo, que había escrito, que me imaginaba escribiendo, que me veo escribir, que escribo. So, I hope I have given you a little bit of an idea of what Salvador Elizondo's work is like. His other important narrative text is Elsinore, un cuaderno, from 1988, and it is completely different from these three that I have kind of touched upon in this video. I enjoyed it a lot, but once again, it is really something else. It is an autobiographical coming-of-age story. Because something that I did not mention before is that Salvador Elizondo lived in many places and studied in many places too. So Elsinore, un cuaderno is about his experience in a school here in the US. He also lived in Germany when he was a kid. He studied in Canada, in France, in England. So you can see this is really a global author, or an author with a global experience, at least. So I hope, based on this, on these comments that I have shared with you, that you will give Elizondo a chance. Many will be attracted or drawn to his cruel little novella, Farabeuf. Others will probably find more, affinity with a text like The Secret Crypt and its metafictional kind of anti-novel approach to narrative. So there's really quite a bit to find in his work. I have read 7 books by him, and I can tell you that in every single one of them I found at least something wonderful, so I am really happy that my professor decided to include Farabeuf in that course, that never happened. So Elizondo is definitely not for everyone, but I think that we can safely say that this is an author that we cannot ignore. Okay, he is a very important author, not only in the context of Mexican letters, but I would say in the whole context of Latin American letters, and I would even say in world literature. I don't really know why he does not receive more attention, especially in the English-speaking world, because he definitely deserves that. I dropped his name in a video that I did on Bruges la Morte by Georges Rodenbach, for the main reason that he is also an author, like Rodenbach, right? Like Carlos Fuentes, like Julio Cortázar, like W.G. Sebald, I'm thinking of the names here now, like Mario Bejatin, right? Who like to include photographs in their narrative works and to explore, the connection between the image and the written text. But, I wanted really to give you more information about Elizondo. So it was something that I had in mind from that moment. I just hope that you enjoyed this video, my 2 cents on Farabeuf or La Crónica de un Instante, El Hipogeo Secreto, and just touching briefly on El Grafógrafo. Do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? I'm always happy to hear them. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.